I burned my 3 children alive in their compound 5 years ago. And you'll never guess what the sheriff did when he found out the truth. My name is Faye Thompson. I'm 81 years old. And I'm the grandmother who bakes apple pies for the church social every Sunday morning in Tellico Plains, Tennessee. But 5 years ago, I did something that would make your blood run cold. I took that old gas can from the shed, walked across our property in the dead of night, and poured gasoline all around the main barn of what they called the harvest community. I struck a match and watched the flames climb higher than the tallest oak tree on our land. And inside that barn were my 3 grown children, Cain, Selah, and Amos. The whole town came to my door the next morning, bringing casseroles and flowers, telling me how sorry they were for my terrible loss, how I was a miracle for surviving such a tragic accident. I let them hug me. I let them pray over me. But the whole time I was thinking about that gas can hidden back in the shed, and how my hands still smelled like sulfur from that match. Everybody in Tellico Plains thought my children were saints. They'd turned our old farm into some kind of paradise for lost souls. People came from 3 counties over to join their community. And there I was, the proud mama, the sweet grandmother who gave their operation a face of trust. I was their proof that what they were building was wholesome and good. For 3 years I believed it too. Lord help me, I believed every word. But you know what they say about still waters running deep. I'm telling you this story now because I can't carry it alone anymore. This secret has been eating at me like a cancer for 5 long years. Maybe you think you know how this story ends, but I promise you, honey, you don't know the half of it. So settle in, wherever you are, and let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you how a God-fearing grandmother from small-town Tennessee ended up with blood on her hands and somehow found a way to sleep at night. This story belongs to anyone who's ever had to choose between what's right and what's necessary. You have to understand something about Tellico Plains. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and secrets don't stay buried long. We got maybe 8,000 souls living here, scattered between the rolling hills and the Cherahalla Skyway that brings tourists through in the fall. It's beautiful country, I'll give you that. The kind of place where the morning mist hangs over the mountains like God's own breath, and the sound of church bells on Sunday morning carries clear across the valley. But beauty can hide a multitude of sins. And Lord knows, I learned that the hard way. My children weren't always what they became. Cain, my oldest, he was the kind of boy who'd carry an injured bird home in his shirt pocket, nursing it back to health with more patience than most grown folks have. Selah, my only girl, she had this laugh that could make a thunderstorm seem like music. And Amos, my baby, he was quiet but steady, the kind of child who'd sit with you through your darkest hours without saying a word, just being there. When they left home, Cain first, then Selah, finally Amos. I thought it was natural. Young folks need to find their way in the world, spread their wings. Cain went off to some kind of religious college out west. Selah followed him a year later, said she wanted to study healing arts, whatever that meant. Amos, he just disappeared one autumn morning when the leaves were turning, left me a note saying he needed to find his purpose. For nearly 10 years, I heard from them maybe twice a year. Christmas cards with pictures of them looking happy and healthy, standing in front of mountains I didn't recognize, surrounded by people I'd never met. They looked peaceful, fulfilled in a way I'd never seen them before. Part of me was proud they'd found something meaningful. Part of me wondered why they never invited their old mama to visit. Then, 3.5 years ago, they came home. Not for a visit, for good. They pulled up my long gravel driveway in a convoy of vehicles I'd never seen before. Old school buses painted white, pickup trucks loaded down with supplies, and people, maybe 30 souls in all, climbing out and looking at my property like they'd found the promised land. Cain walked up to my porch that day, and I swear he looked like Moses coming down from the mountain. His hair had gone long, tied back with a leather cord, and his eyes had this intensity I'd never seen before. He hugged me close and said something that should have made my heart sing, but instead sent a chill straight through my bones. He said, "Mama, we're home, and we're going to build heaven right here on your land." That first week felt like a miracle. I won't lie, my children were back, and they brought with them this energy, this purpose, that seemed to light up every corner of our old farm. They had plans, beautiful, detailed plans, for turning our back 40 acres into something they called the Harvest Community. A place where people could live simply, work the land, and find peace away from what Cain called the corruption of the modern world. The people they brought with them, they seemed so lost, so hungry for something to believe in. There was Margaret, a nurse from Atlanta who'd lost her husband in a car accident. Young Timothy, barely 18, who'd been thrown out by his family, for reasons he never talked about. An older couple, the Washingtons, who'd lost their retirement savings in some kind of investment scam. All of them looking at my children like they were salvation itself. And me. I was going to be the heart of it all. The grandmother figure, the one who'd cook and tend to people and give the whole thing an air of family and tradition. They even built me a special kitchen in the main house, twice the size of my old one, with windows that looked out over the whole community. It felt like a blessing. It felt like God had brought my babies home to do His work. But there was something in Cain's eyes that first night, when he thought nobody was looking, something that made me remember what my own mama used to say about the devil's greatest trick. And that's when everything started to unravel, piece by piece. The first person who made me question everything wasn't one of my children. It was a girl named Lila, who showed up at our gate on a rainy Tuesday in October, about 6 months after the community got established. Lord, I can still see her clear as day. Couldn't have been more than 19, maybe 20, with hair the color of wheat and eyes that reminded me of a deer caught in headlights. She was soaked to the bone, shivering in a thin cotton dress that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. When she knocked on my kitchen door that evening, I thought she was just another lost soul, looking for what we were offering. But the way she looked at me when I opened that door, it wasn't hope I saw in those eyes. It was pure, raw terror. She whispered my name like she'd been looking for me specifically, like she'd walked through hell just to find me. When I brought her inside and wrapped her in one of my quilts, she grabbed my hand with fingers that felt like ice and said something that still gives me chills. "Mrs. Thompson, you have to help me get away from here. Please. They don't know I left, but when they find out," I made her some hot tea with honey, the way I used to do for my own children when they were scared, and tried to get her to tell me what was wrong. At first, she just sat there shaking, staring at the steam rising from her cup, like it held answers to questions she couldn't voice. The kitchen felt so quiet, except for the rain beating against the windows and the old clock on the wall, ticking away the seconds. Finally, she started talking, and what she told me didn't make a lick of sense at the time. She said she'd been living in the community for 3 months, that she'd come from somewhere up in Kentucky after her parents died, in a house fire. Said my Cain had found her at a bus station in Knoxville, crying and lost, and offered her a place to heal and find purpose. It sounded exactly like the kind of good work I thought my children were doing. But then she started talking about the inner circle and the harvest ceremonies, and something she kept calling the cleansing. Her voice got smaller and smaller as she spoke, like she was afraid the walls themselves might be listening. She told me about people who came to the community and then just disappeared, not left. She was careful to say, disappeared. "They tell everyone that folks moved on to the next phase of their journey," she whispered, glancing toward the window like she expected to see someone watching us. "But, Mrs. Thompson, I've seen the belongings. They leave everything behind. Their pictures, their wedding rings. Things people would never abandon. And your son, Kane, he keeps a book. That's when I heard the footsteps on my porch. Lila went white as a sheet, her teacup rattling against the saucer as her hands started shaking again. Before I could even process what was happening, my kitchen door opened, and there stood Kane, with that gentle smile of his that used to comfort me but now seemed different somehow. "Mama," he said, his voice warm as honey. "I see you've met our dear Lila. We've been looking all over for her." Behind him stood Sella and two men I recognized from the community, built like farmers but with eyes that didn't match their friendly faces. Lila made a sound in her throat that was somewhere between a sob and a whimper. "She was just telling me how much she loves it here," I heard myself say, though I'm not sure where those words came from. "Weren't you, sweetheart?" Lila nodded so fast I thought her neck might snap. "Yes, ma'am. I got turned around in the rain and ended up here by accident." Kane's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes. Something cold and calculating that I'd never seen in my son before. "Well, that's easily fixed. Come on, Lila. Let's get you back home where you belong. The others are worried sick about you." As they led her away, Lila looked back at me over her shoulder, and I saw her mouth two words that I pretended not to understand. "Help me." I stood at my kitchen window and watched them walk her back across the field, toward the main compound. Kane's hand resting on her shoulder, in what anyone else would call a protective gesture. But I noticed how her shoulders hunched under his touch, and how the two men flanked her, like guards instead of escorts. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what she'd said about people disappearing, about belongings left behind, about some book that Kane kept. I kept thinking about the way my son's eyes had looked when he found her in my kitchen. Not relieved or grateful, but something else entirely. And I never saw Lila again. The next morning when I asked Sella about her, my daughter just smiled that sweet smile and said Lila had decided to move on to the next phase of her spiritual journey. But when I walked past the women's dormitory later that day, I saw a thin cotton dress hanging on the line. The same dress Lila had been wearing when she came to my door. That night after Lila disappeared, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in my world, like when you're walking on what you think is solid ground and suddenly feel it give way beneath your feet. I kept replaying her words in my mind, the way she'd looked at me with those terrified eyes, the cold calculation I'd glimpsed in Kane's face when he found her in my kitchen. For the first time since my children had come home, I started really watching them, not with a mother's proud eyes, but with the sharp attention you give to strangers whose motives you don't quite trust. The Harvest community had grown to nearly 50 people by then, scattered across the dormitories and cabins they'd built throughout our property. From my kitchen window I could see the daily rhythms of their life. People working in the gardens, gathering for Kane's morning talks, sharing meals in the common hall. It all looked so peaceful, so purposeful. But now I was noticing things I'd somehow missed before. Like how certain people seemed to have privileges others didn't. How there was an inner group that lived in the main house with better food, better clothes, access to things the others didn't have. How some of the newer arrivals looked thin and hollow-eyed after a few weeks, while others seemed to glow with an almost unnatural contentment. Most troubling of all was how people talked about those who had supposedly moved on to the next phase. It always came up in hushed, reverent tones, like they were discussing saints ascending to heaven. But I started keeping track in my head, and I realized that in the 8 months since the community started, nearly a dozen people had supposedly left to continue their spiritual journeys elsewhere. Yet none of them had ever stopped by to say goodbye to me, even though I'd cooked for them, tended to them when they were sick, listened to their stories about the lives they'd left behind. That's when I remembered something that made my blood turn cold. The key. Years ago, when my late husband was still alive, He'd had a locksmith make a master key for all the buildings on our property. Insurance purposes, he'd said. Needed to be able to access everything in case of emergency. I'd kept that key in my jewelry box all these years, never thinking much about it. But suddenly, it felt like God himself had preserved it for this moment. 3 weeks after Lila vanished, on a night when the whole community had gathered for what Kane called a celebration of Thanksgiving, I made my decision. While everyone was busy with singing and fellowship in the main hall, I slipped away to my old jewelry box and found that key, its brass surface tarnished but still solid in my palm. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might wake the whole county as I made my way across the dark property to the building they called the Administrative Center. It was a converted barn that had always been off limits to everyone except my children and their inner circle. Even I, the supposed grandmother of the whole community, had never been invited inside. The key turned in the lock like it was meant to be there. Inside, the space was divided into offices and meeting rooms that smelled of old wood and something else. Something chemical that reminded me of the funeral home in town. I used the tiny flashlight from my keychain to navigate through the darkness, my hands shaking as I tried to figure out what I was looking for. That's when I found Kane's private office, and in it, a filing cabinet that wasn't locked. The first drawer was full of what looked like normal paperwork. Receipts, correspondence, legal documents. But the second drawer held something that made me sink into the nearest chair with my legs suddenly too weak to hold me. It was a ledger book, the kind accountants used to use before computers. But instead of financial records, the pages were filled with names, dates, and detailed inventories. Not inventories of supplies or equipment, inventories of people's possessions, wedding rings with their appraised values, family heirlooms described in cold, clinical detail, bank account numbers and balances, insurance policies with beneficiary information carefully noted. Every person who had supposedly moved on to the next phase was there in those pages, their lives reduced to lists of assets and their estimated worth. Next to each name was a date, what they called the date of transition, and a running total that made my stomach turn over. My children weren't running a spiritual community. They were running some kind of harvesting operation, and the crop they were reaping was human lives. I sat there in that dark office for what felt like hours, turning page after page, seeing the names of people I'd cooked for, people I'd comforted, people who had trusted my family to give them a new start. And at the bottom of the most recent page, in Kane's careful handwriting, was a note that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was Lila's name, with yesterday's date next to it, and below that, an inventory of her few belongings, and a notation about contacting someone in Kentucky about a life insurance policy she probably never knew she had. I don't remember getting back to my house that night. One minute I was staring at Lila's name written in my son's handwriting, like some kind of death certificate, and the next I was sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the refrigerator, that ledger clutched to my chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The numbers swam in my head. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets harvested from people who had come seeking salvation and instead found something unspeakable. Insurance policies, inheritance money, property deeds signed over in trust to the community. All of it flowing into accounts controlled by my children, my babies, who I had raised to know right from wrong, to help people, instead of this. I tried to tell myself there had to be some mistake, some explanation that would make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe those people really had moved on. Maybe they'd voluntarily signed over their possessions as part of some spiritual commitment I didn't understand. Maybe Lila had actually left and the paperwork was just administrative housekeeping. But even as I tried to convince myself, I kept hearing her voice, the terror in it, when she'd begged me to help her get away. I kept seeing the way Kane's eyes had changed when he found her in my kitchen. Cold and calculating in a way that had nothing to do with spiritual leadership and everything to do with protecting something dark and profitable. For 3 days, I carried that knowledge around like a tumor growing inside my chest. I went through the motions of my normal routine, cooking breakfast for the community, tending to my garden, smiling and nodding when people talked to me about how blessed they felt to be part of this beautiful family. But inside, I felt like I was screaming. The breaking point came on Sunday morning during what Kane called the weekly blessing ceremony. The whole community gathered in the main hall, maybe 60 people by then, all of them looking at my son with such trust and devotion as he spoke about love and service and finding peace through surrender. I was sitting in my usual spot in the front row, the place of honor reserved for the community's beloved grandmother figure, when a new family was brought forward for what Kane called the commitment ritual. The Hendersons, a middle-aged couple from somewhere in Georgia, who had lost their farm to medical debt and come here hoping to start over. They had a teenage daughter, maybe 16, with freckles and red hair who reminded me so much of myself at that age. Kane placed his hands on their shoulders and spoke about how they were choosing to release themselves from the burdens of material attachment, how they were ready to trust the community with everything they had, so they could focus on spiritual growth. The crowd murmured approval as the family signed documents that I now understood weren't just spiritual commitments. They were legal transfers of whatever assets they had left. But it was the girl who broke something inside me. As her parents signed away their old life, she looked around the room with the same expression I'd seen on Lila's face. Not hope or relief, but a dawning awareness that she might have walked into something she couldn't walk back out of. When her eyes met mine across that crowded room, I saw my own granddaughter reflected there. I saw every vulnerable person who had ever trusted the wrong people at the wrong time. I saw myself sitting in my place of honor while my children used my presence to legitimize something monstrous. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I made a decision that probably damned my soul, but saved my conscience. I couldn't go to the police. Who would believe that sweet, charitable Kane Thompson was running some kind of death cult? I couldn't confront my children directly. They'd just explain it away with smooth words and gentle smiles, the way they'd explained away Lila's disappearance. But I could make sure it ended. I waited until nearly 3 in the morning, then slipped out of my house carrying the old gas can from the shed, the one my husband had used for the lawnmower decades ago. The September air was cool against my face as I walked across our property toward the administrative building, where all those terrible records were kept. The building where my children planned their harvests and counted their profits from human misery. My hands were steadier than I'd expected as I poured gasoline around the foundation, up the walls, across the wooden steps. The smell of it mixed with the night air reminded me of my husband's weekend projects, back when the worst thing I had to worry about was whether he'd mow the grass before church on Sunday. I struck the match and dropped it without hesitation. The flames caught faster than I'd anticipated, climbing the walls like they were hungry for what was inside. I stood there watching my children's evil burn, feeling something like peace settle over me for the first time in weeks. But as I turned to walk back to the house, I saw 3 figures standing in the shadow of the main dormitory, watching me with expressions I couldn't read in the firelight. My children had seen everything. The morning after the fire, I woke up expecting to find sheriff's deputies at my door or my children confronting me with accusations and evidence. Instead, I found Sella in my kitchen, making coffee like it was any other Tuesday morning, humming an old hymn while she worked. She turned to me with that same sweet smile I'd known since she was a baby, handed me a cup of coffee fixed exactly how I like it, and told me how sorry everyone was about the terrible accident that had destroyed the administrative building. Such a shame she said. That faulty electrical wiring had caused such damage. But wasn't it a blessing that no one had been hurt? I sat there sipping my coffee and watching my daughter's face, looking for some sign that she knew what I'd done. But Sella had always been good at hiding her thoughts, even as a child. She could lie to your face with such sincerity that you'd end up apologizing to her for doubting her story. Over the next few days, I watched the community respond to the fire with remarkable efficiency. Within hours, they had another building converted into a temporary office space. Within days, they'd begun construction on a newer, larger administrative center. It was like they'd been prepared for exactly this kind of setback. But I noticed other changes, too. Subtle ones that probably wouldn't have meant anything to someone who hadn't seen what was in that ledger. The security around the compound got tighter. People who used to wander freely between buildings now had to check in and out with designated monitors. The main gate, which had always been open during daylight hours, was now locked and guarded around the clock by men I didn't recognize. Newcomers who had the kind of hard edges that didn't match the peaceful, spiritual atmosphere my children claimed to be cultivating. Most disturbing of all was how they treated me. Not with suspicion or anger, which would have at least been honest. Instead, they showered me with attention and concern that felt like being smothered with silk. Sella started spending more time in my kitchen, helping with cooking and chatting about old times. Amos appeared at my door every morning to help with my garden, working beside me in silence, like we used to do when he was young. And Kane began including me in meetings and decisions I'd never been part of before, asking my opinion on community matters with a deference that felt more like surveillance than respect. They were watching me. Not openly, not obviously, but constantly. And I realized with a growing sense of dread that they weren't sure what I knew or what I might do next. So they were keeping me close while they figured out how to handle their problem. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the fire, when I discovered I wasn't the only one with doubts. I was hanging laundry behind my house when I heard voices coming from the tree line at the edge of our property. 2 women from the community, Sarah, a widow from North Carolina, and Janet, a divorced teacher from somewhere in Virginia, were having what they clearly thought was a private conversation. Sarah was crying, soft sobs that she tried to muffle with her hand. She told Janet about her friend Marcus, an older gentleman who had arrived at the community around the same time she did. They'd grown close over the months, sharing meals and conversations, becoming something like family to each other. But 3 days ago, Marcus had apparently decided to move on to the next phase of his spiritual journey. The problem was, Sarah had found his glasses in the laundry room that morning. The thick, expensive bifocals he couldn't function without. Couldn't even see his own hand without. She couldn't understand why he would have left without them. Why he wouldn't have at least said goodbye to her personally, instead of just disappearing in the night like everyone else who moved on. Janet's voice was barely above a whisper when she admitted she'd been having similar doubts about her roommate, Lisa, who had supposedly left 2 weeks earlier. Lisa had been planning to write to her sister in Oregon, had talked about it constantly, had even asked Janet to help her compose the letter. But Lisa's stationery was still in their shared dresser drawer, along with the sister's address written in Lisa's careful handwriting. I stood frozen behind my sheets and pillowcases, listening to these women voice the same fears that had been growing in my own heart. They weren't the only ones who had noticed the strange pattern of people leaving without their most essential belongings, without saying proper goodbyes, without any way to contact them afterward. But what chilled me most was what Janet said next. She'd tried to discuss her concerns with Kane, thinking he might have contact information for people who had moved on, thinking he might be able to arrange a phone call or letter exchange. Instead of being helpful, he'd been dismissive and slightly irritated. He'd reminded her that spiritual growth sometimes required complete breaks from the past, that continuing attachments could hinder a person's progress toward enlightenment. When she'd pressed the issue, suggesting that surely as a quick phone call wouldn't hurt anyone's spiritual development. Kane's demeanor had changed entirely. He'd told her that persistent dwelling on people who had chosen to move forward suggested she wasn't fully committed to her own spiritual journey. Perhaps, he'd suggested, she needed to spend some time in meditation and reflection to examine why she was clinging to earthly relationships instead of embracing the present moment. Sarah stopped crying and looked at Janet with an expression I recognized. The same trapped, frightened look I'd seen in Lila's eyes. They were starting to understand what I'd already learned. This wasn't a community. It was a trap. What happened next taught me something I should have learned long ago, that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let people know you're watching them. Because once they know you're watching, they start watching you back. It started with small things. My mail, which used to be delivered directly to my mailbox at the end of the driveway, suddenly began arriving in a stack on my kitchen counter, pre-sorted and opened. Sella explained this away by saying the new security measures required all community mail to be screened for safety reasons. But I noticed that my utility bills and medical correspondence now had tiny tears along the edges where they'd been carefully resealed. Then there was the matter of my weekly trips to town. For months, I'd driven myself to Tellico Plains every Thursday for grocery shopping and errands, one of the few routines I'd maintained from my life before the community. But suddenly, Amos began insisting on driving me, saying he was concerned about my aging reflexes and wanted to make sure I was safe on the mountain roads. He was polite about it, even deferential. But there was something in his eyes that reminded me of how he used to look when he was a teenager caught in a lie, alert and calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much trouble he was in. During those car rides, he'd ask seemingly innocent questions about my conversations with community members, whether anyone had mentioned feeling homesick or uncertain about their commitment. He wanted to know if I'd noticed anyone acting strangely or asking unusual questions. All of this delivered in his quiet, gentle way that had always made people trust him. But now it felt like an interrogation, disguised as family concern. The real revelation came during one of these trips, when we stopped at Miller's hardware store to pick up supplies for some community project. While Amos was loading lumber into the truck bed, I struck up a conversation with Tom Miller, whose family had owned the store for 3 generations. Tom had always been a friendly man, the kind who remembered everyone's names and asked about their families. But when I mentioned that we'd had some folks from the community come through town recently, just making casual conversation, his expression changed entirely. He told me that over the past several months, he'd had quite a few people stop by his store, asking for directions to the nearest bus station or train depot. All of them had been living at our community, and all of them had seemed nervous, jumpy, like they were in a hurry to get somewhere but weren't sure they were allowed to leave. What struck him as odd, Tom said, was that these folks would come in asking for directions, sometimes buying a small item or two. But then he'd never see them actually leave town. He'd assumed they'd changed their minds about departing. Maybe decided to stay with the community after all. But when he'd mentioned some of them by name to other community members who occasionally shopped in town, he'd been told those people had already moved on weeks earlier. The timeline didn't make sense, Tom explained. People couldn't have left weeks ago if they'd been in his store, asking for directions just days before their supposed departures. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I listened to him describe these encounters. People trying to leave but somehow not managing it. People who were supposed to be gone but were still around, asking for ways out. It painted a picture that made my hands shake as I paid for my purchases. On the drive home, I tested Amos with a casual question about whether he'd heard from any of the folks who had moved on to other communities. Did they ever send postcards or letters about how they were doing in their new lives? His answer chilled me to the bone. He said that people who were truly committed to spiritual growth understood the importance of making clean breaks with their past. Continued contact with former communities could create emotional attachments that interfered with their progress. The highest form of love, he explained, was allowing people to move forward without the burden of maintaining old relationships. It was almost word for word what Kane had told Janet, delivered in that same reasonable, spiritual-sounding tone that made cruelty sound like wisdom. That night, I lay awake thinking about Tom Miller's story and about the pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. People tried to leave but didn't make it out of town. People who were supposedly gone were still being seen locally. And my children had explanations for everything that sounded reasonable on the surface, but crumbled the moment you looked at them closely. But the most terrifying realization was that they knew I was starting to understand. The increased attention, the supervision, the careful monitoring of my activities. It wasn't just protective concern. It was containment. I was no longer just the community's beloved grandmother figure. I had become another problem that needed managing, another loose end that required their careful attention. And if I'd learned anything from studying that ledger, it was that my children had developed very specific methods for dealing with problems that couldn't be solved with gentle words and spiritual guidance. The question that kept me awake until dawn was simple and terrifying. How long did I have before I became the next person who needed to move on to the next phase of her spiritual journey? The answer to my question came sooner than I expected, delivered in the form of a conversation I was never supposed to hear. It was a humid October evening, the kind where the air sits heavy on your skin, and every sound carries farther than it should. I'd gone to bed early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, I got up for a glass of water and noticed lights still on in the main house across the field. Something about those lights bothered me. They weren't the warm, welcoming glow of people sharing fellowship or late-night conversation. They were harsh, focused, like the kind of lighting you'd use for detailed work that required concentration, the kind of lighting that suggested business rather than comfort. I found myself pulling on my robe and slippers, telling myself I was just going to check if everything was all right. Maybe someone was sick and needed help. Maybe there was some kind of emergency I should know about. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I was going to spy on my own children because I no longer trusted them with the truth. The main house had been built with my late husband's insurance money, back when I thought my children were creating something beautiful. It was larger than necessary, with multiple meeting rooms and offices that I'd never really explored. As I approached through the darkness, I could hear voices coming from what they called the council room, the space reserved for important community decisions. I recognized Kane's voice immediately, that measured tone he used when he was explaining things he considered important. But there were others too. Sella, Amos, and at least 2 men whose voices I didn't immediately place. The conversation was animated but quiet, the way people talk when they're discussing things they don't want overheard. The building had been constructed with large windows that looked out over the community grounds. But those windows also meant that sound carried if you knew where to position yourself. I found a spot near the back corner, hidden by the large rose bush I'd planted there months earlier, where I could hear most of what was being said. What I heard made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. They were talking about me, not with the loving concern children should have for their aging mother, but with the cold calculation of people solving a business problem. Kane was explaining to the group that my behavior since the fire had become increasingly erratic and suspicious. I'd been asking too many questions, showing too much interest in people who had moved on, expressing doubts about community policies that were none of my concern. One of the men, I think it was David, who handled what they called security for the community, suggested that my age might be catching up with me. Memory problems, confusion, maybe early stages of dementia. It would be natural for an elderly woman to become paranoid and suspicious, especially after the trauma of losing the administrative building to that terrible electrical fire. The way he said electrical fire made it clear that they all knew exactly how that building had really burned. Sella's voice was softer but somehow more chilling than the men's. She talked about how much she loved me, how hard it would be for the community to lose their beloved grandmother figure. But she also spoke about responsibility. Their responsibility to protect the community from disruption, and their responsibility to make sure I received the kind of care I obviously needed in my declining years. Amos, my quiet baby, spoke up with a suggestion that stopped my heart entirely. He'd been researching facilities that specialized in caring for elderly people with memory disorders. Quiet places far from here, where confused older folks could live out their days in peace without becoming agitated by trying to manage concerns that were beyond their understanding. The way they talked about it, they made it sound like mercy, like loving kindness, like the natural next step for a woman who was obviously becoming a burden to herself and others. But I understood what they were really discussing. They were planning to have me declared incompetent and committed to some kind of institution where I could never tell anyone what I'd learned about their operation, where any stories I might tell about missing people and mysterious deaths would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a woman with dementia. It was a perfect solution to their problem, clean, legal, and wrapped in enough genuine-sounding concern that anyone who questioned it would seem heartless. Who would argue with children trying to get appropriate care for their obviously declining mother? Kane's voice brought the discussion to a close, with words that made me understand just how little time I had left. He said they needed to move quickly, before I did something that forced their hand in a less pleasant way. The paperwork could be filed within days, the evaluation could be scheduled for next week, and I could be safely transferred to appropriate care before anyone in town started asking uncomfortable questions. As I crept back to my house through the darkness, my mind was racing with the terrible clarity that comes with absolute desperation. They weren't just planning to silence me. They were planning to do it in a way that would make me look like the crazy one. And once I was locked away in some facility, diagnosed with dementia, and dismissed as delusional, they could continue their harvesting operation without any interference. I had maybe a week before they destroyed my life to protect their secrets. But I still had that master key, and I still had enough fire left in these old bones to make sure their secrets didn't stay buried with me. The next morning I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Not the kind of clarity that comes from peace or acceptance, but the sharp, desperate kind that comes when you realize you're standing on the edge of a cliff, with nowhere to go but down or back through hell. I went through my normal routine, made coffee, tended to my garden, smiled and nodded at the community members who stopped by to chat. But inside I was calculating, planning, preparing for something I never thought I'd have to consider in my worst nightmares. I couldn't run. Where would an 81-year-old woman go that my children couldn't find me? I couldn't fight them directly. They had too many people, too much organization, too much practice at making problems disappear. I couldn't expose them to the authorities because they'd already demonstrated how easily they could discredit me with talk of dementia and confusion. But I could end it. All of it. Permanently. The idea came to me while I was watching the evening community gathering from my kitchen window. Nearly 70 people now, all of them sitting in a circle around Kane as he spoke about the importance of trust and surrender. The newer arrivals hanging on his every word, the older members nodding along with the practiced enthusiasm of people who'd learned that agreement was safer than questions. And scattered throughout that crowd were the predators masquerading as shepherds, my 3 children and their inner circle of accomplices, the ones who knew exactly what happened to people who tried to leave, who helped plan and execute the harvesting operations that had claimed God knows how many lives. They had gathered everyone together in one place, the way they did every evening for what they called community fellowship. The main hall where they held these meetings was the largest building on the property, designed to hold the entire population of their growing operation. It was also the oldest structure, built with the kind of timber frame construction that would burn fast and hot if it ever caught fire. The thought that formed in my mind was so monstrous that I tried to push it away, but it kept coming back, growing stronger each time, fed by images of Lila's terrified face, and the list of names in that ledger, and the conversation I'd overheard about my own impending commitment to an institution. These people had come here seeking salvation, and instead found predators who harvested their lives for profit. They were trapped, just like I was trapped, in a system designed to make escape impossible. The only difference was that most of them didn't know it yet. But would they ever know? Or would they disappear one by one, their deaths explained away as spiritual transitions, while their assets were systematically stolen, and their families told comfortable lies about their loved ones finding peace in a better place? I spent 3 days wrestling with the idea, praying about it in a way I'd never prayed before, not asking God for guidance about whether I should act, but asking Him to forgive me for what I was about to do, because I'd already made my decision. The only question was whether I had the courage to follow through with it. The answer came on Thursday evening, when I saw them bring in another family. The Rodriguezes, a couple with 2 teenage children, who'd lost everything in some kind of natural disaster down south. They had that same look of desperate hope I'd seen on so many faces over the past months. That willingness to trust anyone who offered them shelter and security. I watched Cain welcome them with his warm smile and gentle words. Watched Sela embrace the mother with tears of joy. Watched Amos help carry their few remaining possessions toward the guest quarters. And I knew that within weeks, maybe days, these people would either figure out what was really happening here and become problems that needed to be managed, or they'd disappear entirely into whatever hell my children had created for the people who trusted them. That night, I wrote letters, one to Sheriff Brody, explaining everything I'd learned and begging him to investigate what was really happening at the Harvest community. One to my sister in Florida, telling her I loved her and asking her to forgive me for what I was about to do. And one to God, which I knew was probably pointless but felt necessary anyway. I sealed the letters in envelopes and hid them in places where they'd be found eventually. But not before I'd finished what needed to be done. Then I went to my closet and pulled out the heaviest winter coat I owned, even though the October night was still warm. I went to the shed behind my house and filled the old gas can one more time, the weight of it familiar now in my arthritic hands. And I walked across the field toward the main hall, where my children were holding their evening fellowship meeting, where nearly 70 people sat in a circle, listening to lies about love and spiritual growth. I stood outside that building for a long time, listening to the sound of voices singing hymns, smelling the familiar scents of coffee and homemade bread that had always meant safety and family to me. Then I began pouring gasoline around the perimeter of the building, just like I'd done with the administrative center. But this time, there were people inside. I want you to understand something about that moment when I struck the match. It wasn't rage that guided my hand, or revenge, or even justice in any way that most people would recognize. It was something colder and more final than any of those things. It was the mathematical certainty that some problems can only be solved by eliminating them entirely. The flames caught the gasoline faster than I'd expected, racing around the perimeter of the building like they had a purpose of their own. Within seconds, the entire structure was outlined in fire, the old timber frame crackling and popping as the heat found every weak point in the wood. Inside, I could hear the singing stop, then confused voices, then shouting, Then the sound of people moving toward what they thought were exits, but had suddenly become walls of flame. I stood there in my heavy winter coat, feeling the heat wash over my face like a preview of hell, and I waited, not for the screaming to stop, though it did, eventually, but for something else. Some sign that what I'd done was right, or wrong, or at least finished. The first sign came in the form of footsteps behind me. Heavy boots on gravel, moving fast but not running. I turned around and saw Sheriff Brody walking toward me across the field, his face lit orange by the flames, his expression unreadable in the dancing light. He stopped about 10 feet away from me and stood there watching the fire consume everything my children had built. The main hall, the heart of their operation, the place where they'd convinced so many people to sign their lives away. We stood there together in silence for what felt like hours, listening to the sound of timber collapsing and wondering if we were the only two people in Tellico Plains who understood what was really burning. Finally he spoke, and his voice was gravelly with smoke and something else. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe relief. He told me he'd gotten my letter 3 hours ago. The one I'd mailed to his office earlier that week, before I'd made my final decision. In it, I'd laid out everything I'd discovered about the Harvest community. The ledger with its inventory of human assets, the pattern of people disappearing, the way my children had been systematically harvesting the lives and fortunes of vulnerable people who'd come seeking help. But Sheriff Brody already knew some of it. He'd been investigating the community quietly for months, ever since his own nephew had supposedly left town to join some spiritual group, and then vanished entirely from any traceable existence. The boy's mother, Brody's sister, had been receiving postcards supposedly written by her son. But the handwriting was wrong, and the details were off in ways only a mother would notice. Brody had started looking into other disappearances, other families who'd lost contact with relatives who'd joined the Harvest community. What he'd found was a pattern of people vanishing from all official records, while their assets were systematically transferred to accounts controlled by my children and their associates. But he hadn't been able to prove anything. The community was careful. Their legal paperwork was meticulous, and anyone who might have testified against them had either disappeared or been so thoroughly isolated and psychologically manipulated that their testimony would be worthless in court. He'd been planning to raid the compound the following week, armed with search warrants and federal investigators who specialized in cult-related crimes. But now, as we stood watching the flames consume the evidence and the perpetrators alike, he realized that my solution was probably more final than anything the legal system could have accomplished. The second sign came when the roof of the main hall collapsed entirely, sending a column of sparks and ash up into the night sky like some kind of twisted prayer. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or relief, but a crushing weight of what I'd actually done. 70 people had been in that building when I lit the fire. 70 souls. And I'd sent them all to whatever judgment awaited them, without giving them a chance to repent, to escape, to choose differently. Some of them were predators who deserved whatever fate they found in those flames. But some of them were victims. People who'd been lied to and manipulated and trapped, just like I'd been trapped. I started to cry then, not from grief, but from the awful realization that I'd become the very thing I'd been trying to stop. Someone who decided who lived and who died based on my own judgment of their worth. Someone who solved problems by eliminating the people who created them. Sheriff Brody put his hand on my shoulder, and his touch was surprisingly gentle for such a big man. He told me that he understood what I'd done and why I'd done it. But he also told me that we needed to decide how this story was going to end. We could tell the truth. That an elderly woman had burned down a building full of people because she'd discovered they were running a death cult that preyed on vulnerable individuals. The investigation would expose everything. The victims' families would get some kind of closure. and justice would be served in the most brutal way possible. Or we could craft a different truth, one that would spare the community the trauma of learning just how close they'd come to harboring something monstrous, and spare the families of the genuine victims the pain of knowing how their loved ones had really died. The third sign came as we were having this conversation. I heard sirens in the distance, fire trucks and ambulances rushing to respond to what they thought was a tragic accident. In a few minutes, this field would be full of emergency responders and investigators, all of them looking for explanations and someone to blame. I made my choice then, the same way I'd made the choice to strike that match. Not because it was right or wrong, but because it was necessary. I told Sheriff Brody that I'd been in my house when the fire started, asleep in my chair after taking some medicine for my arthritis. I'd been awakened by the sound of shouting and had come outside to see the main hall already engulfed in flames. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to help anyone. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. Then he walked over to where I'd dropped the empty gas can and picked it up, carrying it with him as he headed back toward his patrol car. Later, I learned that his official report described the fire as a tragic accident caused by faulty electrical wiring in an old building, the same explanation they'd used for the administrative center, which made it seem like the community had been plagued by unfortunate but understandable infrastructure problems. The investigation was thorough but brief. 70 people dead, including 3 local residents, my children, who'd been trying to help their community members escape when they were overcome by smoke. The surviving evidence suggested they'd been running a legitimate spiritual retreat that had attracted people from across the region seeking simpler lives and deeper meaning. There were no survivors to contradict this story, no witnesses to suggest anything other than a terrible accident, and no remaining records to hint at the darker truth of what the Harvest community had really been. 5 years have passed since that night, and I reckon it's time I told you the part of the story that nobody else knows, not even Sheriff Brody, though I suspect he might have guessed some of it by now. See? Everyone thinks I'm the hero of this tale, the brave old woman who discovered her children's terrible crimes and took justice into her own hands, the grandmother who sacrificed everything to stop a cycle of murder and theft that could have gone on for years. And I let them think that because it's easier than the truth, and because some truths are too heavy for other people to carry. But sitting here on my porch, these 5 years later, with my tomato plants growing strong and the sound of normal life carrying across the valley, I need to tell someone what really happened that night, what I really saw in that ledger book, what I really understood about my children and their community. The truth is, I wasn't trying to save those 70 people when I lit that match. I was trying to silence them. You see, when I found Kane's record book, I didn't just discover that my children were killing people for their money. I discovered something much worse. They were doing it because I'd taught them how. The entries in that ledger went back further than I'd let myself remember at first. Much further. The oldest names on those lists weren't strangers who'd joined the community seeking spiritual guidance. They were people I'd known for decades. Neighbors, friends, people from our church who'd come to me over the years with their problems and their pain. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, who'd lost her husband in a farming accident and didn't know how she'd keep her land. She'd signed it over to me in trust, thinking I was helping her manage her affairs while she grieved. The paperwork showed she'd died of what looked like natural causes just 3 months later, and her property had been quietly transferred to an account controlled by Kane. Old Mr. Peterson, who'd been struggling with medical bills after his stroke, I'd convinced him to let me handle his finances. Told him I knew people who could help stretch his money further. He died in his sleep, they said, and his life insurance had paid out to a beneficiary he'd supposedly chosen, another account that led back to my family. There were others, so many others, People who'd trusted me because I was the sweet church lady who baked pies and remembered birthdays and seemed to genuinely care about their struggles. People who'd signed documents they didn't fully understand because I'd convinced them it was for their own good. I'd been running the same operation for 20 years before my children ever came home. The only difference was that I'd been more careful, more patient, more selective about my victims. 1 or 2 a year. Always people who were isolated or desperate. Always deaths that looked natural or accidental. When Cain, Sela, and Amos came back with their grand plans for a spiritual community, they weren't starting something new. They were expanding something I'd already perfected. The Harvest community was just a more efficient way to process the kind of vulnerable people I'd been targeting individually for decades. They'd learned from watching me all those years, picking up on the subtle ways I'd manipulated people's trust and desperation. But they'd gotten greedy, sloppy, too eager to scale up the operation. That's what had drawn attention from people like Sheriff Brody's nephew, and eventually from Brody himself. When I burned down that administrative building, I wasn't destroying evidence of my children's crimes. I was destroying evidence of my own. That ledger contained records going back to the very beginning. Back to when I'd first discovered how easy it was to help lonely old people make their final transitions a little more profitable for everyone involved. And when I burned down the main hall with 70 people inside, I wasn't stopping a death cult. I was eliminating witnesses who might have eventually figured out that the sweet grandmother they trusted was the architect of the entire operation. You see, some of those people had started asking questions, just like Lila had. They'd begun to notice patterns, to compare stories, to wonder why so many folks seemed to disappear right after signing over their assets to the community. Given enough time, someone would have put together the pieces and realized that the common thread wasn't just my children's leadership. It was my presence at every step of the process, my involvement in every major decision, my access to every vulnerable person who joined our family. I couldn't let that happen, not because I was afraid of punishment. At my age, what could they really do to me? But because I couldn't bear the thought of people understanding what I really was, what I'd been for so long. Sheriff Brody suspected something, I think. When he came to check on me in the weeks after the fire, he'd look at me with eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable with. But he never asked the right questions, and I never volunteered the wrong answers. We had an understanding, him and me. He needed someone to blame for what had happened, and I needed someone to protect my reputation. My children made perfect scapegoats, dead cult leaders who couldn't defend themselves or implicate anyone else. The families of the people who died got closure and insurance payouts. The community got to feel safe again, secure in the knowledge that the threat had been eliminated. And I got to keep my secret, to continue living as the tragic but heroic grandmother who'd sacrificed everything to stop evil. But here's what I've learned in these 5 years since. Carrying the truth alone is its own kind of hell. Every Sunday when I sit in that church pew singing hymns, I think about the people whose deaths funded the maintenance of that building. Every time someone in town tells me how brave I was, how proud they are to know me, I remember the faces of the people who trusted me, right up until the end. I'm telling you this now because I won't be here much longer. These old bones are finally wearing out, and I can feel the time coming when I'll have to give my own accounting for the choices I've made. When that time comes, I want someone, somewhere, to know the real story. Not the version that makes me look like a hero, but the version that shows you what people are really capable of when they convince themselves that their needs matter more than other people's lives. Maybe you think less of me now. Maybe you should. But I want you to remember something as you go about your own life, making your own choices about what's right and what's necessary. The most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones who look like monsters. They're the ones who look like your sweet grandmother, your helpful neighbor, your trusted friend. They're the ones who've learned that the best way to get away with terrible things is to make sure everyone believes you're incapable of doing them. If my story moved you, if it made you think about trust and manipulation and the masks people wear, then maybe some good can come from all this darkness. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Talk about it with people you care about. Because the only way to stop people like me is to remember that we exist and to stay alert to the signs that someone might not be who they pretend to be. I'm still here in Tellico Plains, tending my garden and waving at neighbors, looking every bit the harmless old woman I've always appeared to be. And tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know how far my words have traveled, how many people now understand what's possible when trust meets opportunity in the wrong hands. If this story found you, if it spoke to something you needed to hear, I hope you'll help it find others. Subscribe to hear more stories like mine, because Lord knows, I'm not the only one with secrets that need telling before it's too late.